Hi, welcome to the first of a series of short videos about the early history of video game sound. So today's presentation is concerned with a couple of big questions. First of all, how did we get from the earliest forms of computing technology, the first digital computers and even analog computing systems from around the time of World War II, how did we get from there through early computer games, through the first arcade machines, and finally to home consoles as we know them, like the Atari and the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System? In other words, what is the history of what we think of as retro gaming and retro sound? What is the sort of prehistory before Super Mario Brothers and other games that we identify as being the iconic retro examples? We'll be interested to know, how did early game developers work within hardware and software constraints to pursue their creative visions? And finally, what is the legacy of retro aesthetics in today's video games? How do games look back, recreate the technologies and the looks and sounds of older games? So I want to give a couple of highlights first, the broad history that this whole series is going to cover. So we'll begin a little bit before 1962, actually, with the earliest computing machines, but the history of games will begin with 1962's Space War. This is often identified as the first screen-based video game. It actually has graphics and animation. You can actually sit down and play it on a screen. This was developed at MIT in 1962. 9 years later, 1971, Computer Space appears. And Computer Space is an arcade version of Space War. Computer Space would be the first arcade video game. Up to this point, arcades are centered on pinball machines and other analog forms of entertainment. And it was also the first commercially sold game. Computer Space was put out by the company that would become Atari, and it was the first game to be sold from a dealer to a vendor, such as an arcade owner who would then set the game up and profit from people playing it. A year later, 1972, Pong appears in arcades, sort of the most iconic early game, one of the most memorable, one of the games that almost everybody has some idea of. Later that year, at the very end of 1972 into 73, the Magnavox Odyssey appears. And the Magnavox Odyssey is the first home game console. It's actually very similar to Pong, but it uses a sort of unique and interesting system of attachments or overlays to your TV. You take the console home, plug it into your TV, and put one of several transparent or semi-transparent overlays on your screen to make a Pong-like game look like hockey, or this sort of map-based geography identification game, or any number of other different overlays. In 1977, a couple of years later, the Atari Video Computer System appears. Later, this would be known as the Atari 2600. It's called the VCS when it first shows up. And this is sort of the first iconic home console as we know it. It has interchangeable game cartridges and two different controllers on it. The Atari is very successful initially, but through various market forces in the early 1980s, we have what is famously known as the big video game market crash. The market is oversaturated with a lot of imitators of the Atari VCS. Every company sort of wants to put out their own console. None of them are compatible with one another, and a lot of the consoles, and especially the games, are considered to be very low quality. So the market becomes oversupplied. Everyone sort of starts to think, oh, maybe home video games were a sort of flash in the pan, just a fad, and that the Atari was initially successful, but it's sort of over, and maybe something else is going to show up and shape the direction of home entertainment. So finally, our story in this series will end with the years immediately following 1983, when ironically the Nintendo appeared and really took over the market. The Nintendo Famicom was released in 1983 in Japan. It became very popular, and it came to North America 2 years later in 1985. and it came to Europe in 1986. And this was the platform on which we see a lot of iconic games such as Super Mario Brothers, such as The Legend of Zelda, and this will be a good point from which to launch the rest of our investigation. Finally, I want to talk about a couple of the major characteristics that we're going to see in early game sound. First of all, minimalism and abstraction. A lot of the early video game technologies did not have very many capabilities. You had only a couple of channels of simultaneous sound. You were restricted to very simple synthesis or extremely limited sampling. You could actually play back recorded sounds on a lot of old consoles, but the quality was very low. So this means that soundtracks were often sparse. They had to make decisions about what's going to be the most important, the melody, the harmony, the percussion, the bass line, and really sketch out their music as a sort of skeleton of what we might consider a fuller version. This requires a lot of creativity. First of all, from the musicians and the composers themselves, who had to learn to work with a very limited palette. But also, we saw a lot of sort of unorthodox methods to create sound. Creative solutions that were built for single games and would create sound in very novel ways that we're not used to seeing now. So a couple of examples are this heavy wooden block inside the Q*bert arcade machine that would create an actual physical sound of falling. And we also saw sort of technologies from other areas of media being brought into video games. So for example, 8-track tapes were used to actually play back music or play back recorded sound effects in a much higher quality way than arcade machines were capable of in the late 70s and early 1980s. Finally, we'll see a sort of trajectory of new technologies being explored, being incorporated into video games with each new generation. Just as computing power increases, the graphics get better, the processors get faster, we will also see an improvement in the capabilities of sound, from more sound channels, more complex and flexible capabilities, better use of pre-recorded sounds, better use of sampling, or more sophisticated synthesis. You get things that sound less like the iconic retro chiptune based music and more like actual sampled guitars and keyboards and drums. And then this will lead us into the 1990s when we actually start to see real recorded music in video games.